The largest indoor public space on Earth, in 1910, was a train station in Manhattan. The main waiting room rose 150 feet to a coffered ceiling cast in steel and glass, modeled directly on the Baths of Caracalla in Rome. 84 Doric columns of pink Milford granite framed the exterior colonnade. The whole complex covered 8 acres above ground, and 28 acres including the track levels below. 3 city blocks of public ceremony, built so that anyone, of any class, walking off a train into Manhattan would feel they had arrived somewhere. 53 years after it opened, demolition crews began tearing it down. By 1966, every column, every eagle, every block of pink granite was gone. The station was the original New York, Pennsylvania station, and its destruction is the reason American historic preservation law exists. To understand why Penn Station got built, you have to understand the geographic insult it was solving. The Pennsylvania Railroad was, in 1900, the largest publicly traded corporation in the world, its track running across 19 states, its annual revenue larger than the federal government's. And it had no entrance into Manhattan. Trains coming up from Washington and Philadelphia stopped at Exchange Place in Jersey City. Passengers were then put on ferries, actual ferries, in all weather, and carried across the Hudson River to Manhattan piers. The journey from a Philadelphia office to a Manhattan office took roughly 90 minutes by train and another 45 by boat. The New York Central, the rival railroad, controlled the only direct rail entry into Manhattan via Grand Central. For the Pennsylvania this was insufferable. The rivers had to be crossed underneath. In 1899, the Pennsylvania Railroad's new president, Alexander Cassatt, made a trip to Europe that would change New York City. In Paris he saw the new Gare d'Orsay, the first electrified train terminal in the world. Trains entered the building underground, on electric power, eliminating the smoke that had made every American train shed an industrial cathedral of soot. Cassatt understood, on the spot, what this meant for Manhattan. Trains could now enter the island in tunnels, under the rivers, on electric current. The smoke problem, the only real engineering objection to a Manhattan terminus, was solved. He came home and commissioned Charles Follen McKim of McKim, Mead and White to design the building. McKim, who had spent his early career studying the Roman ruins, told Cassatt the model would be the Baths of Caracalla. Cassatt agreed without argument. Construction began in 1904 and took 6 years. Crews dug 2 pairs of tunnels under the Hudson and 4 under the East River, the largest underwater tunneling project of its era, executed in compressed air caissons that gave dozens of workers the bends and killed several. The site itself required clearing more than 500 buildings across 2 Manhattan blocks, most of a neighborhood called the Tenderloin displaced. The pink granite came from a quarry in Milford, Massachusetts, shipped down by the trainload. The roof was a 45-acre canopy of structural steel and glass, fabricated by the American Bridge Company in Pennsylvania and assembled on site. The first trains ran through the new tunnels on September 8, 1910. The station opened to the public on November 27th. On opening day, the building drew tens of thousands of visitors through its doors. They entered through a colonnade of 84 Doric columns on 7th Avenue, then descended a grand stairway into a waiting room 314 feet long, a space larger than the central hall of any other building in North America. Above their heads, the steel and glass concourse roof, a separate structure of arches and skylights, never built before, never built since, diffused daylight onto the trains and platforms below. There were no advertisements anywhere in the building, no stores in the waiting room. Cassatt had insisted on it. The point of the architecture was that arrival in New York should feel like arrival. For the next 40 years, that is exactly how it felt. By the early 1950s, American passenger rail was collapsing. The interstate highway system had not yet been built. President Eisenhower would sign that bill in 1956, but its precursors were everywhere. Post-war Americans bought cars and flew on commercial jets. Pennsylvania Railroad passenger volume, which had peaked during the Second World War, had dropped by half between 1945 and 1955, and would drop by half again by 1962. The railroad began deferring maintenance on the building. Stores were carved into the waiting room walls. Drop ceilings of acoustic tile were installed below the original travertine to hide light fixtures the railroad could no longer afford to clean. The Doric columns outside accumulated soot. The skylights leaked. By 1960, the building was widely described in the architecture press as a ruin, sustained only by the operating revenue of the trains running underneath it. In July of 1962, the Pennsylvania Railroad announced it had sold the air rights above the station to a consortium called Madison Square Garden Center, Incorporated. The deal was worth $115 million over 50 years. Under the terms, the railroad would retain ownership of the underground tracks and platforms, but the entire above-ground building, the colonnade, the waiting room, the concourse roof, would be demolished and replaced with a new round arena and a 43-story office tower. Architectural opposition organized within weeks. A group calling itself the Action Group for Better Architecture in New York wrote letters, picketed, met with the city. The architectural historians Aline Saarinen, Norval White, and Peter Blake led the public campaign. On a placard, one of them wrote the line that defined the protest: "Don't amputate, renovate." The city government took no action. Demolition began on October 28, 1963. Followed was something architectural critics had been arguing for a long time was impossible. The demolition unfolded in slow motion. By union agreement, only a small number of columns could be brought down each day, and every newspaper in the country covered it for nearly 3 years. Reporters photographed the eagles being detached from the cornice and trucked away. The pink granite was hauled to a New Jersey landfill, where some of it still lies under fill. In 1969, the architectural historian Vincent Scully published the line that has been quoted in every history of the building since. Through the old Pennsylvania station, he wrote, "One entered the city like a god." Through the new station, one scuttled in like a rat. The civic shame was by then complete. The city government that had refused to intervene was about to receive a piece of legislation it had not asked for. The legislation was the National Historic Preservation Act, signed by Lyndon Johnson on October 15, 1966, less than 3 years after the Penn Station demolition began. The act created the National Register of Historic Places and required federal agencies to consider the historic value of any building they proposed to alter or destroy. New York City had already moved on its own. In April of 1965, the city had passed the Landmarks Preservation Law, establishing the Landmarks Preservation Commission with binding authority to designate and protect individual buildings. The first major test came in 1967, when Penn Central, the merged successor of the Pennsylvania Railroad, announced plans to build a 55-story tower above Grand Central Terminal. The commission refused. Penn Central sued. The case reached the Supreme Court in 1978, and the commission won, citing, in the briefs, what had been allowed to happen at Penn Station. Grand Central was saved partly because Penn Station wasn't. Fan size on the original Penn Station site today is the 4th Madison Square Garden, opened in 1968, and a 43-story office tower called 2 Penn Plaza. The trains still run beneath it, in the same tunnels Cassatt's engineers dug in 1904. But the station you walk through to reach those trains is, by general agreement, one of the worst major rail terminals in the developed world. A low-ceilinged underground warren beneath the arena, with passages so narrow that during morning rush hour police officers post themselves at intersections to direct foot traffic. The Eagles, 22 of them in total, were dispersed across the country. Some stand at Cooper Union, some at the Hicksville Long Island Railroad Station. Others flank the Eagle Scouts Memorial in Kansas City. In January of 2021, the Moynihan Train Hall opened in the old Farley Post Office across the street, itself a McKim, Mead, and White building, repurposed 88 years after Penn Station was lost. It is, by general acknowledgment, an act of partial atonement. It does not undo the original. Subscribe for more stories of American places that mattered once and then didn't.